All right, guys. Yeah, we have a few regrets, and I'll mention them in a second. So, thank you for your attendance at the June 2023 PRC meeting. I'm a little under the weather, so if I'm more incoherent than usual, I apologize in advance. So we have some regrets. Oh, and we have a resignation. Francois has stepped away from the PRC. He sent me an email a couple of days ago indicating that he just couldn't commit the time to properly participate, and he didn't want to continue as a function of that. So I've thanked him for his service, and that's a shame, but these things happen. We have regrets from Rob, although he did send a report for his committee, so I'll read that at the appropriate time. Peter can't attend, and Irving is in Morocco, so I think he was actually going to make a shot at doing it, but the time, I guess the time difference and the fact that it's much nicer there than it probably is here is why he's not here. So we're a little bit removed from the usual numbers, but we're fine. So let's move on. So we do have a couple of guests here today. We have two. We have Martin. Is it Spielauer or Spielauer, Martin?
Oh, Spielauer, but I'm used to different pronunciations, so whichever is fine.
Okay, so so everybody's information. So Martin is the CCGA student for this summer. He's very fortunately stepped into the breach and agreed to do the Senate Human Rights Committee report for this month. So I appreciate that, Martin. So we'll come back to you for that. But if you want to just say a few things about who you are and your experience with the association, that'd be great.
Yeah, well, thank you, Miles, and nice to meet you all. Just a bit about myself. As you mentioned, I'm the intern for the summer, so I'm currently working at the office doing sort of administrative duties. But I'm a incoming first-year university student at the University of Ottawa. I'll be majoring in economics and political science, and I'm looking to hopefully get into law after that. So this was just a great opportunity. I'm very interested sort of in the criminal justice system. I'm quite new, but I'm getting acquainted with it, and I really appreciate this opportunity. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Martin. We really appreciate you being here. So thank you very much. And then we have Richard Barnhorse. Appreciate he goes by Dick, and that's great. Dick, Howard, you nominated Dick for the position. Did you want to say a few things, or Dick, you take it on, whatever?
Why don't we let Dick introduce himself, and if he's too modest, I will happily chime in.
Good enough. Thank you.
Okay. I think the most relevant thing to know about my background is I was deeply involved in the development of the Youth Criminal Justice Act. And so at the Department of Justice, the last 14 years of my work life were at the Department of Justice. And that involved every stage of that process, from the initial thinking through what the design and policies should be, all the way through, appearing before Parliament and lots of implementation activities in terms of education. Particularly, we did a major thing with the judges with the National Judicial Institute, and that was just an example of many things that we did to implement. And that's basically it. My background as a lawyer. I graduated from Queen's Law. I did a doctorate in law at Stanford, and that's about it, I guess.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you, Dick. Howard's going to chime in here.
Way too modest. I wasn't involved in the YCGA policy initiative, but I was at the Department of Justice the whole time. Across the hall from Catherine Latimer, I would see her occasionally shut off her lights and crawl under the desk because she had a terrible migraine. The political exempt staff were running up and down the hall all the time. Richard and Dick, as I fondly call him, and Catherine Latimer were the two spirits and driving forces behind the enactment of the YCJA. They had a great team, some very good other people, including Tony Dube and others on contract. But Dick and Catherine drove it with the able assistance of the then deputy minister, who I think took on a lot of the political fight. Without George, I'm not sure it would have been as successful. But those of you who've had a chance to read the first article we highlighted in this week's newsletter, Dick has a paper there, a fabulous paper that highlights the demonstrable drop in incarceration rates under the YCJA compared to the YOA and the one before it, the JDA. But even as the incarceration rates were clearly significantly dropping under the YCJA, which oddly enough, under the YOA, incarceration rates for youth was higher than even the United States, which we take as the bellwether for the highest in the world, just because Russia and China don't regularly report. But Dick and Catherine and George Thompson and all of the people involved were very successful in bringing that down dramatically. And then they noticed that there was an upward tick in the remand rates, as we're experiencing in the adult system as well. And Dick was responsible in a second wave, if I can call it that, amendments around 2010, 2012, that were very successful in bringing down the remand rates. And so when we're looking at a serious problem in Canada of remand rates in Ontario and across the country of roughly 70% of the provincial inmate population are remanded. They're presumed innocent and awaiting trial. What Dick did in the YCJA is a model for the adult, and frankly, everything in the YCJA is a model in the adult. And Dick, as I say, Dick and Catherine were the driving force behind it. They had a lot of great help. But again, George Thompson, I have to give credit to. I had the opportunity to walk into meetings with the minister after George and Richard and team had met, talking about the YCJA, and the next item was the faint hope clause. So it was a tough morning, but George Thompson looked like he'd gone a few rounds with a heavyweight. He fought very hard to allow Dick and Catherine to do what they were doing, and again, and the implementation, not just the legislation, but its implementation is the gold standard as far as I'm concerned. So anyway, kudos to you, Dick. I hope you don't mind me going on at length, but it's a wonderful story to tell.
No, thank you very much. That was quite complimentary. Thanks, Howard. You're right.
Thanks, Howard. And Dick, wonderful to have you. So thank you very much for offering to serve, and we appreciate it very much. All right, moving on. So item number 2, approval of the agenda. I circulated that on Friday. So can we have a motion to accept the agenda? Okay, Howard, seconded.
Asking unanimous consent.
Okay, thank you. All in favor? Wonderful, thank you. Likewise, the minutes went out a day or two later. So again, a motion to accept the minutes for last month's meeting.
Asking unanimous consent.
Okay, all in favor? Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so moving on. So we have a number of news items that I want to just, and obviously Howard again obviously covers them wonderfully in the circulation of the newsletter he does every week. The first one is one we talked about last month, and actually a motion was passed, but it needs some clarification. So last month we talked about the potential extradition of Hassan Diab, right? Basically back to France. Our motion was to write a letter to the minister setting out our objection to a great degree regarding the extradition. Some further conversation after that motion with Irving and Howard came back to the conclusion that it's not our position or that of the CCJ to basically promote or try to assist an individual in these kind of circumstances. So we wouldn't be able to, in anything we wrote to the minister, indicate that that we're writing it for the benefit of Diab. I think that's a fair assumption of our conversation. And then Howard also mentioned that the Human Rights Committee is doing a report on extradition, and that it may be more beneficial for the PRC to have that report in hand before we send anything along to Lamedi. Matthew, you had a comment?
Well, of course, I regret that position. I have never agreed with the CCJA policy that exempts our moving on behalf of an individual who is likely the victim of injustice and what have you. So I will simply state my point and remain silent.
Okay, thanks. Yes, Howard.
just a bit of clarification. I mean, Irving, who wasn't involved in our conversation last week, I wish he was here today to speak to this, is kind of the keeps us honest about CCJ policy and reminded us of not intervening in particular cases, in specific cases, that we ought to rise above that. I had suggested, and I think it's something worth pursuing, that we might talk about the process, not specifically DIAB, but the process. I've just uploaded into the chat a link to the parliamentary committee report, and I will come back to that in my report. It's an excellent committee report, comparing it to other reports they do, and I'll chat more about that. But there is, I think, Miles, should the committee be so advised or so desirous, I think there is some room to write to the appropriate ministers to talk about the need to change the extradition process. But I can speak on that more later.
Yeah, let's put that over to your further report. Any other questions on this issue? Okay. The second news item I had relatively recently is the retirement of Russell Brown from the Supreme Court. We touched on this, I'm not sure it was last meeting, but I think it was. And we're just, at our last meeting, we just simply said we wait and see what happens, because at that point, he had stepped away from sitting on the bench. There was a judicial committee proceeding underway. That's now all come to an end. His retirement ends that committee's work right away. Justice Brown is indicating that he's going to lay out his case for public consumption, I presume, with respect to his innocence in this matter. But, you know, the unfortunate end result of all this is that, you know, a jurist of some renown has now retired because of a particularly personal incident that, you know, it was, and personally, I think it's a shame that it went down this particular road. Does anybody want to add to that? Yes, Matthew.
I'd be interested in the reaction of the three lawyers here present as to whether you accept Justice Brown's rationale that he wanted to protect the Supreme Court and its upcoming agenda, or conversely, that he did not want to go through a trial in which there would be considerable negative information lodged against him. What is your view, counsel?
You have no counsel.
Dick,
Oh,
Dick,
well, there's three of you.
That's true.
Dick, any thoughts you want to share?
Not really. I just read it this morning in the paper that he had officially resigned, and I did find that his reason was fairly weak and not very persuasive, but that's about as far as I would go.
Yeah. I mean, no matter which way you look at it, no matter what happened, the facts really don't mean much anymore at this stage of the game. The damage is done. It's unseemly that this happened. It's the first time a Supreme Court justice has resigned in this manner. Brendan, you had your hand up earlier.
Yeah, and sorry, by the way, I keep turning my camera because I'm just on my phone, so that's why it's off. But what I want to say about this is it's a little ironic. I'm not going to comment on the reasons for stepping down, but there's a bill, as I'm sure you're all aware, there's a bill. Actually, I think it just passed, and something I'll address later. There's a bill about the investigations into justices, and one of the concerns among many of the senators and the witnesses was that judges could step down before the completion of an investigation. So I just thought it was a little ironic. This is what's happening in this case. But if you're saying that Justice Brown is going to be giving out reasons or something like that, I think that is probably a good thing. But I think that might have an impact. Well, like I said, the bill was passed, but I wonder, or the bill is now out of the committee, but I wonder if that's going to come up later on in deliberations on this particular bill. The timing is just uncanny between the two.
Well, yeah, sure, absolutely. Keep tabs on the bill. We'll refer to it in our agenda later as well. But here you go. Anything else on this particular issue? Howard.
I mean, my sentiment's the same as Dick's and yours. The whole thing is very sad. It just was appointed by, I think, Harper. He certainly was of a conservative bent. which in the area of criminal law was helpful because he was vociferous in his defense of the accused and in pushing back big government and police powers. But he was an intellect of great renown. Peter Sankoff did a tweet about him saying what a good guy he is, how he liked people. We'll never know what happened. Public intoxication is a problem for any adult. And that appears to happen. Like Brendan, I find there's some irony in all of this. He was in Arizona to give a speech at an award given to Louise Arbour. And so it kind of rained on her parade, the whole event, a little bit. I think she must find it a little bit unfortunate that that's what came out of it. But it is too bad. I kind of would have liked to have heard more about it in terms of a public inquiry, but I understand him not wanting to face that. The whole thing raises that specter of the last public judicial inquiry where the Alberta provincial court judge who was appointed to the federal court complaint was brought against him. He was the one who told the complainant in a sexual assault to just put her bottom down in the sink and close her legs and she wouldn't be raped or something. Anyway, the other case, not Brown, the other case was kind of indefensible. But it raises the specter, and I'm sure that was in Brown's mind when he thought, I don't want to live through this. I don't want my family to live through this. And anyway, it's as Brendan says, it may be that these new amendments will provide, among other things, more options for the Judicial Council to intervene in these kinds of cases in more surgical ways. But they're very awkward, and I think once the Judicial Council indicated they were going to go to public hearings, not just a full investigation to public hearings, I'm sure Brown thought, I don't want to live through that. But anyway, it's sad. It's just a sad story, the whole thing. So anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's brought to mind when you're mentioning the keep your knees together thing. There's also the Associate Chief Justice in Manitoba, Lori Douglas, who is going through the same thing because before she was appointed, she didn't mention that her husband had filmed her in a pornographic video, as in her husband pimped her out to somebody. And the fact that she didn't disclose that before the appointment basically ended her career. And she stepped back and after quite a while, 3 or 4 or 5 years, she stepped back to have this investigated. And before it got to a public inquiry or any kind of hearing with the committee, it did start in the committee, and it was a mess. They went through a hearing, and then they stopped it, they adjourned it, and they said we're going to start all over again. And she quit. Right? She just that was enough. And so and that's a fairly high. It's not as high as Justice Brown, but the Associate Chief Justice of the Manitoba King's Bench now. Is a high position. So, these things happen, sadly. All right, guys. The next piece of news is an article that Howard sent me. I appreciated it a couple of days ago on legislation in New York State, which basically is passed a piece of legislation sealing convictions of a certain age. So there was misdemeanors of 3 years and felonies of 8 years is the time frame. So they're going to seal them, which is what we've been arguing with, and we have a brief that's already been out there for quite a while. Basically saying the same thing, and it has the same exception that we proposed and Kim Pate proposed in her bill. If it's a conviction for a sexual assault, it never gets sealed, right? It's always available as a matter of public record. So that was nice to see. I mean, it reiterated that our brief mentions California in it. California has a very progressive system in place for spent convictions, and it's quite successful. And there's this one in New York mentioned, I think, 2 or 3 other states that are doing it. So it seems to be something that is catching on, and that's obviously a very good thing. And it's something that we keep pretty good tabs on here, as well as what's happening in Canada. And Kim Pate's bill is still moving through the private members system of whatever it takes to get wherever it has to go. Anything on that for anybody? It's straightforward. And the last one I had is, and we touched on it, is Paul Bernardo being moved to medium security. Do we want to add anything to what we've already talked about?
Well, as a criminal justice group, are we banned from any commentary on the Bernardo matter? I mean, there have been calls for the resignation of the commissioner. You already mentioned several politicians. I think you forgot to mention Poilievre, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. So I'm kind of intrigued. What does CCJA do when the criminal justice system is being highly politicized and being misused? What do we do? Do we stay silent because it's an individual, or do we make an argument and write an op-ed piece in the Globe and Mail talking about this issue? You know where I'm coming from.
Well, I'm certainly open to suggestions. You know, yes, Brendan.
I just have a quick question. I guess so. Like, my understanding of this whole controversy is that he's now in a medium security facility.
Correct.
Would it be worthwhile then? I mean, think about ways forward. Could we simply talk about the process of how that works and what the actual difference is? Because I feel like a lot the general public doesn't understand the differences between these. I think the idea being pushed out there that he's just wandering like the forest alone and can leave whenever he wants, despite the fact that medium security is still quite strict.
Well, yeah, it is, and this particular facility in Quebec has all the security apparatus in place, the wire around the edges and security and what have you. There's been quite a, and I think if we're talking about the process, there's been quite a few articles already that have basically said this is the process, and it's a risk analysis that is done every few years, and he's just gone through the process. He hasn't been given any more favor than anybody else in the process. He's been evaluated with whatever, and they have a number of pre-populated forms that they are filled out basically for the risk assessment. But I mean, we wouldn't be saying anything new, I don't think, when it comes to us simply saying that what's happening is what the system allows to happen.
Well, that's fine up to a point, but it's a very conservative response. My view is that the politicization of the criminal justice system around fear and loathing and punishment has to be addressed head on, rather than simply laying out what the rules are.
Well, Howard?
Just another aspect of this is, my understanding, the Minister of Public Safety has basically demanded that a review be done of this placement, the reclassification of Bernardo from maximum to medium. It may be that review will turn out to find that he should not have been transferred. It seems to me it's pretty clear that review was the result of sort of political comments. It's a careful line. We always have to remember, of course, that CCJA receives some sustaining funding from Public Safety Canada. They have never asked us to pull in our horns. So I don't think we should let that stop us. But I think an argument about politicization of decisions that are bound by law, and Matthew, you know the CCRA better than most of us, it is a requirement and a regular requirement for a review of classification. And as Brendan says, him going from maximum to medium after 34 years, whatever it is, isn't the same as him going to minimum security. But Matthew, there's something more general about the process, about political commentary from the minister, Poilievre, and the premier, politicizing a particular case and a process that's governed by law. It may be that we could do something on that rather than necessarily focusing specifically on Bernardo. But Matthew, if you wanted to try your hand at a bit of a letter, I would support that. You could bring it back to the PRC. We could have a look and talk about it a bit. I don't know how long this review is going on. I don't know whether we'd want to get something in before the review to say, don't let politics interfere, or maybe after the results of the review, which I suspect will go against Bernardo. But anyway, those are my thoughts.
Well,
yeah.
I'd be
I agree,
happy
Howard.
to accept. I'd be happy to accept an assignment, but I would amend it a little bit, Howard. I'd rather write an op-ed piece for the Globe and Mail on behalf of the association, and then let you folks tame it down.
But that's right. We have so many editors.
You know who was a great editor? It was our late friend and a president of the association out in British Columbia. And he was a wonderful wordsmith, and he was extremely tolerant of my wide-eyed views.
No, he was and an expert in corrections as well. He is missed for sure. But we have a lot of good people. I mean, I presume the board. I wish Irving were here to give us some help on this. I've never seen the CCJA publish an op-ed piece. Normally, what we would do is write to the appropriate ministers and suggest a view. But Matthew, my sense would be if you want to try your hand at something, it could take a variety of forms. And Irving himself is a pretty good editor and keeps us true to dispassionate discourse. But Matthew, it seems to me if you're willing to take on writing something, we could bring it back and talk about it. Maybe talk about it by email, because our next meeting is going to be September, I think. Isn't that right, Miles?
Yeah. We usually go from the summer recess and come back September 8th or 9th, whatever it is. So I think that if you're going to do that, Matthew, and I second that you do something, then send it to us and we'll circulate it and get it out there, because 3 months is going to lose its effectiveness. So sure, absolutely, get something to us and we'll circulate it appropriately. And if you want to do it as an op-ed, if that's something that we can do and it doesn't contravene any policy positions we have, we'll do that.
Okay.
Very good. Thank you, Matthew.
I have one comment.
Sure, Dick.
I agree with what Howard said earlier about the Tony Du, Jane Sprott piece, which I think was an op-ed in the Toronto Star. And they make the point, but they make the point that the law requires this kind of consideration. But it wasn't kind of the main thrust, as I remember. Maybe you do, Howard. It didn't seem to be the main thrust. They were more critical of the obvious politics involved in the thing. So I don't know what we're asking Matthew to do exactly, but I think something that just explains the law would be, or primarily, not only, primarily explains what the law is, would probably be informative and helpful to people, and wouldn't simply be another piece like Tony and Jane's piece.
Well, Dick, I may end up disappointing you.
All right. Okay.
I don't come from a government background. I come from a civil rights and nonprofit background. So Miles and Howard will let you know that I'm there.
Fine. Disappoint me. That's fine.
All right, guys. Anything else? Any other news items? Those are the 4 that I had. Yes, Howard?
Sometimes I feel like I'm hawking my newsletter. I want you to know I don't get any money for it. But anyway, there's just one really interesting piece there. It's about the 3rd item down. I think it's the American Sentencing Project, which is very good. And it's a paper that focuses on the age group, the offender from 18 to 25. And it explores a little bit the not just emerging, but pretty well established body of psychological evidence that says 18 to 25 are much more developmentally like under 18. And it talks about the number of life with no parole, life without parole sentences in the United States imposed upon someone between the age of 18 and 25, and how cruel that is, that there's not even a judicial review. There's not even a faint hope. So at 19 years old, you're sentenced to life with no possibility of parole. What kind of hell is that? They call it, in their article, they have an expression, I think it's death by imprisonment or something like that. But it's a death sentence. They will never get out again because there is no possibility of parole. And then the point is that this group, 18 to 25, are in various stages of development. I think our own thinking under the YCJA has sort of confirmed that there's this added group. So anyway, take a look at that. I think it's a great study by the Sentencing Project. The U.S. Sentencing Project does a lot of good work. So I thought, worth having a look at.
Thanks. Thank you, Art. All right, guys, let's move on. For updates, there isn't anything new. There's nothing new. I mean, Peter is still preparing the draft brief on the prospect of Alberta having its own provincial police force. I added an item. It was Irving asked me to do it. It deals with StatsCan, police reported Indigenous and racialized identity data. He asked me to put it on simply because they've written to him asking if there is anyone who wants to do a virtual meeting with StatsCan on this issue. So he put it out there basically saying, does anybody want to volunteer for that?
Miles, can I just so is StatCan seeking input on those issues? Is that the issue? Is that
well, I mean, let's see now, as opposed to just listening. No, they want feedback. Yeah, they're looking for input.
okay?
Miles,
And sorry, Howard.
No. I'm interrupting. My apologies. I just wondered if it's related to the thing that Kyle did. You circulated a draft position. Is it the same consultation?
You know what? I don't know. I'd have to take
Kyle's piece was in response to the chiefs of police and StatsCan some time ago indicated they were going to start to collect disaggregated data.
Yeah, it is. It's the same.
So Kyle's piece is quite good. I mean, hopefully we'll talk about that. It's too bad Kyle isn't here, but Kyle's piece I thought is a good basis for participating in that, and maybe Kyle would be the right one to do it with Irving. But just a suggestion.
Well, we'll get to that in the agenda, but I think that makes sense, and so I'll probably contact Kyle and tell him of the invite that Irving forwarded, and he'd be the guy.
Well, does Brendan want to join Kyle?
Yeah, I'm a little curious about it myself, and just maybe as a quick little update for the rest of the committee. I'm no longer with StatCan. I actually changed positions, but still, like Justice Data and all that, it's still very much up my alley. So I would be curious to sort of see what's going on, if that's all right.
How about when I email Kyle, I'm going to invite him to have a conversation with you.
Perfect. Sounds good to me.
Sure.
Because now there's no conflict, Brendan, right? You
Exactly. Yeah. For
Brendan,
those, sorry, Howard. Yeah.
I was just saying, do you want to tell people where you are now? I think it's so exciting.
Yeah, for sure, since it sort of came up like that. So I've just started a new position with the Civilian Review and Complaints Commission for the RCMP. So interestingly, there's a bill before Parliament right now. I think that will probably be what Rob is going to be talking about at SecU, Bill C-20, where we're following very closely here. But anyway, just started, very interesting, and so that's where I am now.
Excellent.
Mass Casualty Report says, Brendan, that you have a full-time, lifetime appointment.
Yeah.
Excellent. Congratulations, Brendan. That's great. Good for you.
Thanks, Mouse. Thanks, everyone.
All right, guys. Business arising. We're moving on to parliamentary committees. So let's start at the top. So the Commons, Justice, and Human Rights, and that's Howard, please.
Okay. 6 meetings of this committee since our last PRC on May the 9th. No future meetings scheduled at this time. I just note that the House is currently scheduled to adjourn for the summer at the end of next week. So I'm not expecting much more from this the standing committee before the summer recess. But they are extremely busy. In fact, I could take the whole meeting just talking about what they're doing. Instead of focusing on the meetings, I want to focus on their subject matter. So there were 3 bills and 2 reports, all within this roughly the space of a month. I'm going to go over them quickly, but if people have questions, don't hesitate to let me know or send me an email and I can send you some links. The 2 bills they spent the most time on were, curiously enough, what I call private members' bills. One bill C-295, the other one a Senate bill S-224. Technically, they don't call the Senate bills private members because they're senators, but it's a non-government bill. 295, I mentioned last time, private members bill by Hedy Fry, a well-known former minister in the Liberal cabinets. This particular bill, among other things, among other related things, proposes to amend the criminal code to create an offense for long-term care facilities, their owners, and their managers of failing to provide the necessaries of life to residents. So there is already a criminal code offense of failing to provide necessaries if you're in a specific duty in relation to the individual. This would be a little bit more precise. I don't know if it adds a lot, but I really see this as a COVID response bill. And people were so upset about the way, about the death rate, about the mortality rate in long-term care. And we've seen provincial legislation as well trying to increase the requirements on long-term care facilities, which are all, I think, are not all, but many of them are for profit. And the mortality rates were high. In other cases, people who had elderly parents there weren't able to even go and see them. So elderly people were cut off from the world. Anyway, this bill, I think, is sentimentally partially response. It also tries to increase the liability on owners and managers and talk about where they may go next. But being a private members bill, it is moving quite quickly, I suppose, relying on the sentiment about the COVID, about what occurred during the COVID. There have been 2.5 committee meetings since our last PRC meeting. The most recent was on yesterday, on June the 12th. Evidence is not yet available, but the notice of the meeting indicated they would start by clause consideration, which you will know is the last stage in the committee consideration of a bill. When I looked at the evidence this morning, it doesn't look that like clause by clause started. But my guess is there's a lot of small p political momentum behind 295, and that it will move out of committee fairly quickly and back into the House for report stage 3rd reading. So keep an eye on that. The other bill, again, a very interesting one by Senator Selma, and I apologize, I probably won't pronounce this correctly, but Ataluhajan. She's a woman who was a politician in India, appointed by Harper to the Senate, a very impressive individual by all respects. She has sponsored and carrying a bill, S224. It's not a government bill. To amend the criminal code to add precision about what constitutes exploitation in the context of trafficking in persons. So there's a requirement in the current criminal code that requires the subject of the exploitation to fear or to be put in a position where a reasonable person would fear. And people complain that this is making prosecutions way too hard. There are not a lot of prosecutions brought, and even fewer are successful. In the House, this bill is again has a head of steam on it. It's already passed through the Senate. It's had 2nd reading in the House and is at committee. The sponsor in the House is Colin Kerry, a conservative member. And he says at its heart, this bill aims to align the criminal code's definition of trafficking in persons with the 2000 Palermo Protocol. Now that was, the Palermo Protocol was adopted in 2000 at the 55th session of the General Assembly of the United Nations, and Canada is one of the signatories to that. What this would do is remove what they call as the unfair burden placed on exploited individuals who under Canadian law must prove that there was an element of fear in their abuse. So they're trying to eliminate that or repeal it. The senator who introduced it in the Senate said this, and it causes me a little bit of concern. She said the bill aims to facilitate the conviction of those charged with human trafficking related offenses. I hope she means the conviction of those who are guilty rather than just charged. But it's clear that they regard that the definition of exploitation is harmful, and the amendment would have the effect of changing the law so the Crown is no longer required to prove a reasonable person in the victim's circumstances feared for their safety. So it seems like an odd element to the offense, but stay tuned. The bill on yesterday, there were 4 witnesses appearing yesterday, so we'll have a better sense of how it moves through committee the next time we meet. It actually, given the steam, there's every chance that this bill will pass by even the summer recess. The Senate always sits a week or so longer, but of course this is in the House now. But if it gets through the committee in the House and through report stage and third reading, it will become law. I didn't check to see it's bringing into force provisions, but it may be on royal assent. I can check on that and get back. So anyway, those two bills are moving quite quickly. The third bill is Bill C-41, an act to amend the criminal code. Its title is actually not very helpful, but I talked a little bit about this last time. It's an amendment proposed to the criminal code to create a regime by which the Minister of Public Safety can authorize eligible persons to carry out in a geographic area that is controlled by a terrorist group activities that otherwise would be prohibited under paragraph 83.03 round brackets B, which deals with providing, making available property or service for terrorist purposes. So again, the context of this is the Taliban in Afghanistan, because it actually forms the government. And so that human rights organizations that have been active in Afghanistan, some of which have been thrown out, particularly where women represented the humanitarian organizations, felt that they were potentially liable under our own criminal code if the services or work they did benefited the government, which itself is recognized as a terrorist organization. So there was an odd, perhaps an over breadth of the anti-terrorism financing legislation, and this bill seeks to address that, to provide if you will, kind of an exemption. But the exemption wouldn't be a category or a legal category. It would require particular permission, approval, a case made to the Minister of Public Safety on a case-by-case basis. So on May 29th, the committee in the House concluded clause by clause. The bill was amended and adopted on report stage as amendment. It has now received third reading yesterday, and it's in the Senate for pre-study. So again, this is a bill that's moving fast. There are 3 or 4 different departments that are pushing this: Justice, Global Affairs. There's another one that deals primarily with voluntary sector organizations, but there's a great concern among them that they might well find themselves afoul of the criminal law simply by trying to provide some assistance to people in Afghanistan, which would be a terrible shame. So anyway, it's moving quickly. Keep an eye on that. Again, interesting piece of legislation. This one is a government bill, but it has moved with a speed that we rarely see these days in government legislation. So let me move from there to the 2 studies the standing committee.
Howard, Matthew just said, sorry, Howard, Matthew's got his hand up. This is the second time. I just want to.
My apologies, Matthew. I go to my screen where I have my notes.
I know you love to talk, Howard, and I hate to interrupt you.
Please go ahead, Matthew.
Did anybody give testimony on Parliamentarian Fry's bill about the issue of over-incarceration and over-criminalization of all the staff and folks that run retirement homes?
I haven't listened to all of the evidence, so I can't say for certain, but I think the push behind this as a response to the public concern about extended care homes and the COVID mortality and morbidity rates, I don't think anyone's stopping to say, but wait a minute, are we over criminalizing? I don't even see a strong response saying, do we need this at all, right? Because failure to provide necessaries, the current criminal code provision would more than likely cover these offenses. There is, as I say in that bill, an attempt to reach out a little bit to get to the managers and the owners so that they can't resign and then go on to do something similar. So that's a bit different. But Matthew, I take your point. Over-incarceration ought to be something that's considered in every bill. We always talk about lenses, making sure we have lenses viewing various issues, race, gender, all sorts of other things. But over-incarceration is a lens that probably should be applied to all criminal justice bills. But Matthew, that's a long answer, but I don't see any evidence of that from what I've seen, sadly. Shall I go on back just to I scroll away from the video screen to read my notes, so please just yell if you want me to stop. Or the two reports are interesting. The first report follows on, let me find my screen, follows on C41. Obviously, in the context of the hearings over C41, there was a lot of talk about Taliban and all of that, and so the committee decided that it needed to issue a report to the House that firmly denounces the Taliban and rejects any recognition or legitimization of their control over Afghan territory. Their report, which is basically one paragraph, talks in particular about gender discrimination, systemic violence targeting minority communities, reprisals against former members of the Afghan National Security and Defense Forces, attacks on freedom of the press. The one, I think, don't get me wrong, what they're saying, of course, no one could in the right mind disagree with, but I have to wonder what value it is for this report, apart from the bill itself, to be sent to the House. The committee is not calling on the House or government for a response to it. But the last line of that report says the committee believes that the Taliban must remain a listed terrorist organization, which of course is a live issue because now they form the government. If Canada were to recognize the Taliban government, that would potentially conflict with them being listed as a terrorist organization and the ramifications for that. So anyway, following on C41 and the success of that bill, and it's moving quite quickly to adjust so that we're not criminalizing humanitarian groups working in Afghanistan, the committee felt the need to denounce the Taliban, and so that report is there for what it's worth. The one I wanted to talk a little bit more about,
and I interrupt for just 1 second?
Please do.
When I read the minutes about Bill C41, I didn't realize it was focused on the Taliban Afghanistan. Does it have domestic application? Could it happen within Canada? Could police be given extraordinary powers that would otherwise violate the law? That's what struck me when I read it. Or is it limited to like Afghanistan?
No, I believe its focus, Dick, is international scenarios and theaters. And I haven't considered whether it could in fact be used. You're talking about someone, for instance, who might be financing an environmental group that maybe the police regard as eco-terrorists, and whether they could be criminalized. And I think I can't answer. And so take a look at the bill itself. It's not a long one, but the terrorist financing stuff isn't something that I've ever taken apart and looked at. So it may have some application to that. I doubt that. I think the perspective, remember, it's the Minister of Public Safety who has to grant the exemption. So the Minister of Public Safety might be disinclined to grant an exemption to a Canadian humanitarian group who saw themselves supporting what's believed to be an eco-terrorist. I think the presumption or assumption is that in Canada, this isn't a problem. The problem is in Afghanistan, Syria, Saudi Arabia, potentially Iraq, Iran. So often we're looking at all of those other bad countries out there and not looking at ourselves. But it's a good question, Dick. The bill is a short one, but you have to go immediately to the anti-terrorism provisions in the criminal code. But remember, in this particular case, it's a mechanism that it would be the Minister of Public Safety that gets to make the decision. So how they use that might be interesting to see, whether a case is brought by someone in Canada or a group supporting a protest group in Canada, whatever they may be, whether it's environmental or indigenous or whatever it is. So, but excellent point. I wish I could answer it more convincingly, but let me just
Howard, I'm sorry. I just want to add the bill. The bill, basically empowers the minister to do what the bill is looking to do in a geographic area that's controlled by a terrorist group, right? And that, by its very nature, takes it outside of Canada. Yeah.
Unless it were a reserve, I don't know. I think Dick raises a good point. I would hope there is no case where a humanitarian group that's providing assistance to, let's say, a remote indigenous reserve. I can't imagine in Canada an indigenous reserve being regarded as a terrorist organization. But Miles, I think that highlights the point about it being focused at regimes. I wondered whether it applies to the Kurds, who we generally regard as allies, but they have these huge refugee camps where there's so many people that the Kurds had taken from Daesh, had arrested, had confined. So anyway, its scope is something I'm not an expert enough to know, but I think the focus is not Canada. And as you say, it's focused on areas where geographically it's terrorist. It's dominated by a group we regard as terrorists. But does that extend to India? Does it extend to Pakistan? Does it extend to China? I just don't know. I would think that's one of the reasons why they inserted the mechanism instead of a broad exemption by class or description, a mechanism where the public safety minister has to bring his or her mind to bear on each particular case. Okay. So if no other questions on that, and remember, just speak up because I scroll away here to my notes. I think the report on extradition is incredibly important, particularly given what we were talking about with Diab. The report itself is called Reforming Canada's Extradition System. And let me just, I've put the link in the chat. Let me know if it's not there. You can click on it and go right to the report. But the conclusion alone I find quite interesting for a report of this committee, which tends not to be the most active or the most aggressive, if I can put it that way. But the committee says they had heard calls for comprehensive reform of Canada's Extradition Act. Cases were cited as evidence of real harms resulting from flaws in our existing legislation and process. Injustices that will likely continue to occur in the absence of reform. They go on at the end to say the committee urges the government to act quickly to reform the Extradition Act and Canada's extradition process to prevent further injustices resulting from flaws in the system. And recommendation 20 is that the government of Canada undertake comprehensive reform, not just review, but reform of the Extradition Act as soon as possible, and in the interim, to try and make procedural changes that will process changes that will help to blunt the injustices. Now, the report is pretty clear. Diab is mentioned a lot. One of the things that surprised me is there's no mention of Meng Wanzhou. I'm not pronouncing that. Meng Wanzhou. My apologies, but the famous American, the United States used Canada as a pawn in this Chinese national, right? And we were held well, I was going to say gunpoint, but China retaliated when the United States demanded the arrest of Meng Wanzhou, or however it's pronounced, in Vancouver, and we held her and went through the whole extradition process until finally it resolved through the legal process. But China kept punching at us, imprisoning our own nationals, charging them with spying, and there are a number of other Canadian nationals still there. But China certainly lit into us. I think there's a real sense that Canada was used by the Trump administration to kick China, and of course our ministers didn't feel they could exercise any discretion to avoid the extradition process of her, so we let it work its way through the system. Anyway, I'm surprised that isn't mentioned in this particular report. There's a lot of recommendations that have to do with evidence. The first recommendation is the government commission an independent review of all extradition treaties, with a view in recommendation 2 to modernizing outdated treaties and withdrawing from treaties with partners that seriously contravene international human rights. So that's probably not Diab or Meng Wanzhou, but there are other things like lower the required threshold to rebut the presumption of reliability of the extradition partner's record of the case at the committal hearing. Now that's directly applicable to Diab. There's also discussion in there about the fact that, as you recall, Diab was extradited after great process here, including an appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada, sat for 3 years in a prison in France. They weren't ready to try him. The understanding in extradition is you extradite someone only when the other jurisdiction is ready to try them. France clearly was not, and when he finally went before 2 investigative judges, he was discharged, came back home. The investigative judges' decisions were overturned by the Court of Assize in France, and he was convicted. We like to say in absentia. He wasn't there physically, although he was represented by counsel. To my knowledge, we do not have a request yet for a second extradition, but there is a warrant that was issued by France for his arrest. So the debate goes back and forth about a lot of people are chiming in saying it's too Kafkaesque that Diab should never be extradited a second time on these charges. Quite apart from the Diab case, to argue a little bit of what Irving would argue if he were here, I think there's enough in this report that suggests that there are serious flaws in the process that allows the extradition of a Canadian citizen based on such flimsy evidence that would not likely survive pre-charge screening by a competent prosecutor in Canada, which the threshold for that is a reasonable prospect of success. There was never what we would have considered a reasonable prospect of success in the Diab case based on the evidence as our court system had seen it. And they said as much. Mr. Justice Méranger in Ottawa said it was so flimsy. But under the Extradition Act, it's like the test for committal at a preliminary inquiry. Some evidence, any evidence that might be believed is enough. Just one final point with respect to France. Of course, France won't extradite their nationals to us. It's clear in this report and in other things written about this that there was a Catholic priest accused of sexually assaulting Inuit children in our north. France refused to extradite him under our treaty. So why are we extraditing a citizen of ours? I had always understood that the reciprocity principle required it. At any rate, there's a lot in this report. It's a very strong, forceful report. Normally, we don't hear such condemnation of a system. Conflict of interest, my daughter-in-law works for the Mutual Legal Assistance Group in Canada, in Department of Justice, Ottawa, and I'm always debating about this with her and always saying that the threshold is wrong. And then she tells me that the justice has better policy that has a higher standard. So why not amend the act? But Justice Canada was well represented throughout all of the hearings, and the report cites Janet Kinsey, who was the head of that group in Justice Canada. But I commend the report to you. I apologize for going on so long, but this committee is so busy. There's so much going on, but let me just stop there. Any questions I'm open to, or you can send me an email and I can follow up with you. Matthew, yeah.
Well, it sounds to me, Howard, while Irving doesn't want us to identify the Diab case because we would be proselytizing an individual, it sounds to me like the Standing Committee has already done that for us, and that we can simply cite the Standing Committee's report to the Minister of Justice as a critique of this situation. So I don't think Irving is correct on this issue, that CCJA cannot take a position that involves an individual when that individual has already been mentioned at length in a parliamentary report. Am I wrong?
I'm not going to argue for Irving, but I think we need to hear him on this. As the executive director, he's the keeper of our conscience and all good things, fair and balanced. Matthew, I agree with you that I think there's lots in this report that a letter. I don't think we need to do a CCJ brief, but a letter, if Miles were prepared to take a crack at it, to say clearly there's a problem with the process, although it may not be necessary for us to say we agree with the committee's report. Surely there's enough here for the responsible ministers to conduct on an expedited basis a review of the extradition process with a view to some of the apparent I want to say miscarriages, but I won't use that word. But we've had too many cases recently where this extradition act has been used for purposes that don't align with Canadian values, and I include the Meng Wanzhou case where Trump, I think, wanted to kick China and used us to do it, and we ended up getting kicked instead. But Matthew, if Miles, Miles maybe get a chance to take a look at the report and the recommendations. I don't know why we couldn't say, have a look, we agree with this. We think there's a serious case here for urgent review of the extradition act and process. I don't think that would run as afoul of the individual case rule that Irving would cite, but we should hear from him on it. I know he's not a supporter of the Diab case. He sends me stuff all the time from France. That supports the decision made by the Court of Assize in France, and I have trouble with it. But if we focus on process and there's an authoritative report here, I think we could bolster that or indicate support for that.
So I'm a little confused. Irving supports the Assize in France overturning the magistrate.
This is always the problem with speaking for someone else, but Irving is skeptical still as to whether or not Diab is innocent or guilty. And Irving's point is, although there's a lot of push in Canada to say it's a miscarriage of justice, it's a wrongful conviction, Irving's not sure that's correct. And he's saying, look, a competent court in France has convicted him. And why didn't he show up for his trial? So all I'm saying is that Irving is, and properly so, looking at the other side. I mean, we get caught up in these bandwagons. And so, I don't know whether Diab did it or not. I don't know that anyone can actually ever know at this point. What I do know is that the process stunk. And to me, that's the value of focusing on the process, that no Canadian citizen ought to be rendered, certainly not a second time, for trial on handwriting evidence, some of which wasn't even his handwriting. But anyway, Irving has concerns about whether, in fact, Diab may, in fact, have been guilty. But I don't want to speak for him, so please don't quote me or take my words on it. I think we need to hear Irving. When Miles and I were communicating about this by email, Irving reminded us that we try not to comment on specific cases. And there's wisdom to that, particularly when the case may come before the courts again. But
so here's what I propose. I will read the report, and I will potentially draft something up, but in concert with Irving. I want to make sure that before I do all that work, reading the report's no problem at all, that it doesn't run afoul of our policies. So I think we can do it. I think we do it on a wait and see basis, and I'll start that this week with reading the report, and then start some communication back and forth and see where it goes.
So, Miles, in all fairness here, if you disagree with Irving's editing, are you bringing that disagreement back to the PRC?
Matthew, you're a real troublemaker.
I know. Well, listen, it would be in September, so time heals all wounds. So we'll have to see. I don't have a pat answer for you, Matthew, at this point. So let me just start the process and see if it's going to go off the rails.
When I was sitting in Miles' chair as the chair of this, Irving and I would often go back and forth. But he's a very sensible guy, and he does compromise. And but at any rate, I'm sure we'll all get a chance to look at it. Matthew, the extradition thing has legs for months and months and months, if not years, whereas the Bernardo issue is more time sensitive. But the extradition one, I think the PRC could easily look at something in September if Miles did a draft and shared it with Irving. But I always find Irving reasonable. But it's his perspective on this is quite different than mine, and it would be useful to hear him talk a little bit about it. Of course, he is in Morocco. He's got to be careful what he says, right?
All right, guys. All right, thank you. So I guess that's it. That's it for you, Howard.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, guys, let's move on to the next committee meeting. It's the Commons Public Safety and National Security. Rob is away, but he did send me his notes for the summary of SECU's proceedings in the last month. I'll read those for the purpose of the record. So SECU met 4 times since the PRC's previous meeting. All 4 meetings concerned Bill C-20, an act establishing the Public Complaints and Review Commission and amending certain acts and statutory instruments. So on May 30th, 2023, the committee resumed consideration of Bill C-20 through appearances by the Minister of Public Safety with representatives from the Department of Public Safety, Canada Border Services Agency, and the RCMP. The bill is being promoted as ensuring a robust, independent review of law enforcement agencies so that all Canadians receive equal, safe, and fair treatment by the agencies that are designed to protect us. Highlights of the bill include the following. 1, the establishment of the Public Complaints and Review Commission, being an independent civilian review body for both the RCMP and CBSA, the first independent review body for the CBSA, who currently has only internal review. 2, the flagging of non-national security RCMP activity, with the PCRC reporting its findings and recommendations to the RCMP Commissioner and Minister of Public Safety. 3, a requirement for the PCRC to implement public education to raise public awareness of the Commission's mandate and an individual's right to redress. 4, the PCRC having the authority to recommend disciplinary measures with a requirement for the RCMP Commissioner and CBSA President to report to the PCRC Chairperson and Minister of Public Safety on whether discipline was initiated or imposed. 5, annual reporting to the Minister of Public Safety and the collection of disaggregated race-based data. And finally, investment of $112.3 million over 6 years, and thereafter $19.4 million per year. On June 2nd, 2023, the committee resumed consideration of Bill C-20 through appearances by several police organizations, the Customs and Immigration Union, a University of Toronto professor, and the Quebec Immigration Lawyers Association. No evidence was available as of today. June 6, 2023, the committee resumed consideration of Bill C-20 through appearances by several Indigenous groups, a lawyer as an individual, and the Canadian Council for Refugees. No evidence was available as of today. And on June 9th, 2023, the committee resumed consideration of Bill C-20 through appearances by several police organizations, including an Indigenous police organization and the Canadian Association of Refugee Lawyers, and no evidence was available as of today. So unfortunately, I can't really take any questions, but if you have any, please feel free to email Rob. I'm sure he'd respond and answer any questions you may have.
Miles,
Yes.
sorry to interrupt. I just thought maybe I'd add a couple things again, just since I'm following this bill so closely, because it involves essentially changing my current organization to overseeing the CBSA. Just a few things I think might be helpful to note. There's pretty well cross-party support for this bill about going forward. Police organizations are pretty for the oversight. They'd like the oversight. However, one thing that I think is coming up that might prove a little problematic is that several witnesses want all investigations of RCMP members to no longer be conducted by the RCMP. Currently, as it stands, it's what is now known as the CRCC, will often outsource the investigations to other RCMP members because we simply don't have the staff. We're an organization of 80 people. We can't investigate those things. So there is just some contention about, will that practice continue? Will the offloading of investigations to the RCMP continue or not? The biggest item seems to be I don't want to call it the sticking point because everyone seems to be in agreement, is that the biggest hurdle is sufficient funding for the organization to actually undertake more investigations. That's all I'd add to that.
Thanks, Brendan. Any questions for Brendan? No? Very good. Okay, the third committee is the Senate Legal and Constitutional Affairs, and again, it's you, Brendan.
Yep, I'll just turn off my camera because I get to look at my other screen. Sorry. So the Standing Senate Committee on Legal and Constitutional. Oh, sorry. Can you still hear me?
Yep, you're good.
Oh, perfect. Sorry, I thought I heard something. But the committee has met 8 times since the last PRC meeting. They've actually met on a variety of different bills. So 3 of the meetings were on Bill C9, which is an act to amend the Judges Act, as I mentioned earlier. 3 meetings were on Bill C47, which was the budget implementation bill, but also had changes to the criminal code. Another meeting was on Bill S212. It's an act to amend the criminal code. This is Senator Kim Pate's bill on record expungements. And 2 meetings were also on Bill S12, which is a Senate government bill. It's an act to amend the criminal code and other acts. It's the bill that responds to, and I apologize, I don't know how to pronounce the name. It was a Supreme Court case striking down mandatory addition to the sex offender registry. And so that has just come through committee. It just was very recent, late last week, I believe. I haven't had as much time to go through the transcripts or the videos of that one yet, but I can still look at it a little more. I can still give some information, I should say. So Bill C9, it's an act to amend the Judges Act. It proceeded through a clause by clause on May 17th, and it passed third reading in the Senate on June 1st. To my knowledge, it has not yet received royal assent, but because I think a draft with various amendments were sent to the House of Commons. I admit I'm not as familiar with what happens in this case. I think the House of Commons now has to reconsider the amendments, if I'm not mistaken. Some notable amendments that were made were that originally the bill did not include the possibility to sanction a judge, because the idea was if the transgression is sufficient to warrant any type of sanction, then it's sufficient to be removed from the bench. Despite that, the senators agreed to add various other forms of sanctioning, whether that be a suspension or whatnot. That is now on the table as one of the amendments. Another amendment was added to collect race-based data and other socio-demographic information. Notably, one thing that was changed was that so in a case like we have with Justice Brown, where he steps down and the investigation ceases, or if a complaint is found to not warrant further investigation, the committee now has to present those yearly statistics on any sort of complaint that was substantiated or not, that was withdrawn or not. And they also need to specifically note that, again, for complaints that went forward or did not go forward, they have to note if the complaint regarded sexual misconduct or any suggestion of bias or discrimination or racism. Also, I'd say just again, I don't want to take too much time, but the most significant amendment I think is that if you recall at previous meetings, I had mentioned how originally the bill didn't only allowed for an appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada. It skipped over the Federal Court of Appeal. Many lawyers and the government didn't exactly want that for a variety of reasons, one of them being efficiency. The senators added an amendment to allow appeal to the federal court. Yeah, again, concerned. I'll leave it at that. I will put in the chat the link to the report. A report is available online, and like I said, I'll put that on in the chat for everyone to see. Bill C47 again was the budget bill. It was a draft report was considered. This is another case of a large bill going through Senate. A report was tabled where the Senate admonished the government quite severely for putting so much in this bill, especially criminal justice amendments. The committee responded that they felt they didn't have sufficient time to look at everything in enough detail. One thing that I think I hadn't mentioned previously, but it's something I realized a little bit later. Aside from this bill changing the criminal rate of interest, one thing is that it is changing is allowing for the police to search mail going through Canada Post. From what I gather, police are currently not allowed to search mail that is internal to Canada, but there are concerns about drug trafficking and small amounts going through envelopes and whatnot. interesting. I actually just heard about a case in the news about a young man ordering benzodiazepines through the mail and overdosed on it. So essentially, he's ordering illegal drugs through the mail. And so this bill is proposing changes to that. And I think that passed, but again, the Senate tabled a report being very critical of the government's approach in this. As I said, there's a meeting on
Brendan,
Bill S2.
Brendan,
Oh,
can I
sorry.
stop?
Yes, Matthew.
Stop you there.
Of course.
Brendan, does CCJA have a policy about political parties, not just the Liberals, using the budget bill to add all these hidden amendments that have nothing to do with the budget?
That's a good question.
Conversely, should we have a comment? Because I know Kim Pate and other senators have been critical of misusing the budget bill in this fashion. So do we have a responsibility here as criminal justice folk?
I like personally. I think it wouldn't be a bad idea, but I haven't been on the committee as long. But it's a longstanding problem that crosses political lines. So I don't see why it might be an issue if we did. Oh, Miles, if you're talking, you're on mute.
Sorry, guys. Yeah, I tend to think it's probably a little bit beyond our remit to be dealing with that kind of procedure. It's a long-standing practice. Harper was famous for doing it. Liberals are now doing it, although they weren't. They at one point said they weren't going to do it, but they do because from a political expediency point of view, they get a lot of stuff passed within a bill that's too large to do much about. So I get your point, Matthew. I just don't think that it's focused enough on criminal justice for us to be complaining about a practice that is just universally accepted. I stand to be corrected.
If I can just jump in, I poor Brendan. Matthew, you know more about CCJA policy than any of us. You've been around longer than pretty much any of us. Poor Brendan wouldn't be able to answer that question, and you probably can. Having served with the Department of Justice for 27 years and being involved on more than one occasion with bills that were called omnibus criminal law amendment bills. They were supposed to be focused on procedure, but sometimes everything but the kitchen sink would be dragged in. I can tell you that those of us who worked on them and put them together were not happy putting all of this stuff together. I can remember occasion we argued to the minister directly that this should not be all put together in one bill, and the minister said, "Why not? Put it all together and go ahead." And damned if the standing committee didn't split up the bill. And the trouble, among other things, in doing that is when the committee split up the bill, they screwed up all of the concordance, all of the related amendments, and all of the references to other bills. It's a nightmare when the committee splits a bill as opposed to just as Canada drafters. But there is and has always been a legitimate comment about putting too much together in not just criminal, but any social policy bill where it essentially hides stuff, it prevents it. And the Liberals did this with Lavalin. You remember with this, they snuck in a budget bill, the whole procedure that allowed them to avoid prosecution with a remedial agreement that no one had heard of because it was stuck in a budget amendment bill. There is a principle that whether it's an omnibus bill or a budget bill, criminal stuff shouldn't be hidden. And we used to have legislative drafters who would just tear us a new one for trying to put too much in there. And often we're red in the face, left to say, but the minister's office told us to do it. The minister wants it done. So I don't know. Matthew, we could probably shout until we're blue in the face. I don't know that would have any impact on this. But my suggestion is we take it under advisement and think about it. And maybe at some point there might be a clear-cut example of somewhere where we would argue that accountability what people like to call transparency, argues against hiding criminal justice stuff. But anyway, that's my 2 cents worth for what it's worth.
Miles, is it
Matthew,
legitimate to ask our friend Irving to consult the CCJ archives on this issue?
we could ask Irving anything. We could ask Irving anything we want, whether he always answers anyway. If he wants to respond to us accordingly, that's certainly no harm done.
Make the motion.
Is there a second there?
I would second.
Okay.
I can second.
All in favor? Alrighty.
Thank you, everybody.
Are you doing this, Matthew?
No, I'm delegating it to those people who have a lot more expertise and authority than I will ever have.
Okay.
You.
Take your PS with us. Okay. Thank you. I will do that. I'll do that. Okay, Brendan, continue, please.
All right. For sure. So like I had mentioned, another meeting was on Bill S-212. It was the record expungement bill for Senator Kim Pate. We had a few witnesses with lived experiences of having their record expunged or having difficulty having their record expunged, including the Fresh Start Coalition, the Black Legal Action Committee Center, various women's shelters, etc. All of them were in favor of the bill of Kim Pate's bill. One thing I just mentioned, this bill was last looked at in March. I think it took the back burner as an bill in the Senate. But one thing I just want to draw attention to, and it kind of rubs me the wrong way every time this bill comes up. Senator Boisvenu is the critic on this, and I found it's been a little rude to some of the witnesses, especially in this case. He keeps bringing up, and it's something that comes up in a lot of the committee meetings when it comes to victims, especially of sexual offenses and whatnot. And it will actually reemerge in Bill S-12, which I'll discuss in a moment. So this bill proposes automatic record expungements, but from what I gather, from what I understand, it excludes the expungement of sexual offenses. I think it's Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 or something along those lines. I'm not an expert in the criminal code and all that, but my understanding is that it excludes that. That was the impression of the witnesses who were appearing. But Senator Boisvenu, on a few occasions, he said something along the lines of, "Oh, it's unfortunate you don't actually understand this bill." And I thought that was a little aggressive, particularly to some of the witnesses. And it's a point that keeps coming up. And despite the fact that most witnesses are saying no, that sexual offenses will be excluded from this, will not receive automatic record expungement, it's something he keeps bringing up, and it seems to be the main concern in this bill. And it's, again, I just wanted to sort of highlight that. It's rubbed me the wrong way as an observer, honestly as a citizen, and it's just been bothering me a little bit. But that's where the meeting ended. Essentially, it hasn't moved much further forward. I'm not sure how much more it will before the end of session. The final bill, Bill S-12, it's an act to amend the criminal code to be in line with ensuring that that being put on the sex offender registry is charter compliant. It just arrived at committee earlier last week, and it all, on top of changing automatic registration on the sex offender registry, it also allows for witnesses to request not having a publication ban, providing victims the ability for information on the offender going forward, and more or less to be kept up to date on the goings on of the case and the offender post sentencing. Again, I haven't been able to look through all of the transcripts yet because they came out relatively recently. One thing, again, I would note here is that the bill has a small carve out where any sexual offense against a child is still an automatic registration on the sex offender registry. And that is the only automatic registration, versus there is a presumption for all other cases. From what I gather, there's a presumption that someone will go on the sex offender registry for sexual offenses, but there's the possibility to argue it. Again, Senator Boisvenu in this case was saying that why isn't there an automatic presumption for all types of sexual offense for women and things like that, despite the Minister of Justice who appeared on this, explaining that it was to be charter compliant. The senator was not pleased that there was a carve out for children and not for other sexual offenses. He said it's incongruent logically, but the minister contends that it's a small carve out that is justifiable under the charter. And that's about as far as I got on that. And I think that's going to kind of be the conversation going forward, but I'll report back as soon as I hear more. And that's it for me.
Thank you, Brendan. Anybody have any questions or comments? Yes, Stefan.
I have a question in terms of, for example, suspension of records. I was talking to John Howard Society people a couple of weeks ago. I was kind of surprised that they tell people if they want to apply for record suspension, they have to, it takes about 2 years, the whole process. Is that not a lot of admin stuff? Is that length of the process, is that addressed in any bill, whether it's regarding suspension or expunging a record? That's, you know, having a record can affect both housing and employment, which are really critical factors in terms of ex-offender getting his or her life back on track, you know. So
of course. Yeah, you're completely right, Stefan. And that's actually one thing that's also in Kim Pate's bill. It actually does have, I believe it has changes to the human rights bill to include. It does mention housing, but I admit I can't remember exactly what was on there. But with the automatic record expungement, the idea is that it will no longer take 2 years. It's an automatic expungement or an automatic sequestering, I should say. So that's part of the impetus for the bill, is that administrative process is no longer on the individuals themselves.
and also, as you might know, when you apply for a suspension, for example, it's really a complicated process in that John Howard Society, I understand some provinces, they don't charge much, but in Toronto, for example, they charge $500 plus the $50 that goes to the Pro Board of Canada. So that can also be a barrier for some people who want to get a suspension.
Of course, yeah. The barriers are dizzying. It's astounding how many barriers there are, and I think that's the point of this bill. And maybe I'll just mention the Minister of Justice appeared previously on this bill and was not exactly supportive of it, saying that the government has their own bill. But that has been a common thread, is that it's been a common thread, the barriers to getting these suspensions and what they cause, how much harm they cause in the lives of people.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Brendan. Howard?
Miles, just a quick comment in response to Brendan's response or concern about Boisvenu. Brendan, you're not the first one to note this. You certainly won't be the last. I don't know if you know, he has a personal history. His eldest daughter was murdered. And
I looked it up because I was curious.
Yeah. He is a strident victim, particularly as it relates to gender or gender-based or sex-based violence. And I think, although it's not an excuse for intemperate and factually incorrect responses, it may explain why other people don't call him on it. The fact that he had a family member murdered his daughter, and I don't recall if there was sexual activity, but anyway, it kind of gives him a position that makes other people reticent to challenge his otherwise ill-considered comments. But I've noticed, as have others, Senator Boisvenu is of course appointed by Harper, and I say that only because we know former Prime Minister Harper's views on criminal justice, and Boisvenu fit squarely within those views. So just, I'm glad you looked him up. I just you're not alone. So.
Yeah, and actually, speaking of erroneous statistics, there's been a few times where he cited statistics that I know are, I'm like, that's not correct. I think he made the assertion that 2/3 of cases in the criminal court are either sexual assault or assault. I'm like, that's not correct. And then, like I say, sort of lords over some of the witnesses, and it's a little concerning sometimes. Sorry, Miles.
No problem. Thank you, guys. We should move on. Time is not our friend right now. Let's do our fourth committee meeting. I'm very pleased to ask Martin to present this report for the Senate Human Rights Committee.
All right. Thank you, Miles. So the Senate Human Rights Committee met about 3 times since I assume was the last PRC meeting. So between May 9th and June 13th. So 2 of those meetings were held to discuss just general human rights issues, specifically within federal institutions such as the Canadian Human Rights Commission, the CHRC, and the public service. And so it was mostly just a panel of witnesses and experts around the matter who touched on sort of this systemic racism within these organizations. And so an employee, Ms. Becci of the CHRC, sort of witnessed or gave her testimony of systemic discrimination as a racialized employee of this organization. And there were members of the CHRC who sort of commented on it and vowed to increase training to reduce racial bias. But sort of more concrete things were the Human Rights Commissioner for British Columbia sort of advocating for a direct access human rights model, which is exclusive, I believe, to BC and Ontario, if I'm correct. I'm not entirely sure. I think, yeah, I think Ontario has a direct access human rights model, essentially leaving out the commission as the middleman for complaints. And she argued they would leave more resources to commissions to increase education and sort of fight more systemic issues as opposed to case-by-case issues. There was also the national president of the Public Service Union, sort of reiterating the fact that there is a class action lawsuit that was filed by racialized employees of the public service, which is ongoing, aimed at sort of suing for damages, including the wrongful failure to promote sort of equity within the workplace, and other issues such as being denied promotions based on race, and other sort of instances of systemic racism. So that was mostly just the 2 meetings, wasn't too eventful and didn't really touch on a specific bill. And the more recent one was held yesterday, the 12th of June, and the subject matter was Bill C-41. As Howard mentioned, it made it through the House of Commons, the 3rd reading, and so presently it's in the Senate pre-study stage. So we'll be awaiting a report, I suppose. The Minister of Public Safety appeared before the committee, sort of to comment on the piece of legislation. Just well, Howard mentioned it, but it's the idea that with the approval of the public safety minister, an entity would not be liable for section 83.03 circle brackets 2, which is providing, making available, etc., properties or services used by a terrorist group. So it, in the House of Commons, it received more than enough support. The main opposition was from the NDP, who argued that was mostly against the idea of a third-party authorization from the government to provide this humanitarian aid. But apart from that, it was mostly multilateral and bipartisan. And so, and I suppose that in the following meetings, it'll be discussed further. And that's pretty much it. I mean, there was a witness from different workers or representatives from the different departments, public safety, global affairs, and the Department of Justice, sort of supporting this bill.
Okay, Bart, is that it, Martin?
And that's pretty much it. I don't think there are any upcoming meetings that I saw on the meeting schedule. As I mentioned, the most recent one was yesterday, and it was just sort of the aim was sort of just to touch on, or to just touch on Bill C-41,
right.
kick off the pre-study stage in the Senate.
Very good, wonderful. Thank you. We're grateful for your input. So thank you very much, Martin. All right, guys. So let's do the business arising. I'll only touch on things because of the timing, things that are actually new. So the only thing that's been added to this section is Kyle's report, which was circulated with the agenda. And further to our discussion already on this, I will write to Kyle mentioning that Brendan would like to have a conversation with them, and they'll come back to see how it's going to be addressed with respect to potentially attending the session that SaskCan is going to put in place. All right, bills under consideration. Again, here we'll only deal with bills that are introduced as far as any change in status is concerned. So let's just see. So Bill C-48, this could take a while. This is the bill to amend the bail provisions in the criminal code with respect to essentially the imposition of reverse onuses for those with violent convictions. Anybody want to take a run at this? Howard?
This whole process sucks. This is almost worse than the Bernardo. Who can say worse? This is political interference at its worst, with every premier in the country signing a letter saying you've got to have more reverse onus provisions. When they aren't helpful, don't do anything. Some of them are not charter compliant. The only thing I want to say about this is I'm taking on 2 more pro bono law students starting in the fall through the winter. And so this is one of those areas where I would suggest that we would see if one of the students is interested in doing a bit of a brief on this. One of my students from this year that's just concluded was doing a paper, which I don't yet have, I'll share with you when I do, on remand populations, intersectionality with unrepresented and indigeneity. So I don't have that yet, but I know this bail thing, I think we need to wade in on not just on the bill, but the whole, how misunderstood, how the real problem is the population. Again, Tony and Jane have written on this, and others have written on this. It's a terrible push by politicians who don't seem to understand or don't care about the systems of legislation that's ineffective. But my suggestion is we see if I can get one of my pro bono students. The government had thought this bill might go through before the summer. I don't think there's any way in the world. It hasn't gone past first reading, as far as I recall. So I think we should have time in the fall to perhaps put together a brief on it, and that would be my suggestion.
Yeah, thanks.
Howard.
And Brendan?
Yeah, sorry. I was just gonna say, Howard, if you're gonna send it to one of the students, I'd be more than happy to help out on that. I can't take point on it. Just between work and trying to finish my studies, I don't know if I can take that on, but I'd be more than happy to help out. Maybe collaborate.
Brendan,
Great.
I'd be happy to have your help as always. We've done this before. Last time we did a brief, I think on C5, you were fabulous. Just remember, you need to think about your current particular position. I don't know if you filled out a conflict of interest code in the Federal Public Service.
I did it StatCan. I need to submit it here.
Yeah, you need to submit one here, and you need to talk to someone a little bit about whether, now any brief that's produced won't have your name on it. It will be a CCJ brief, so you won't be publicly identified, but just want to make sure that they understand the kind of work.
What I do.
Yeah.
Of course, yeah. I'm gonna get on that ASAP, Howard. Just my I'm going to the mediation, but yes, I'm aware. Thank you.
Happy for the help.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, there aren't any other commons government bills that have been introduced since the last meeting. As far as private member bill in the commons, we do have actually a few. We have Bill C-332.
Miles, can I interrupt you there?
Sure.
In the spirit of time, may I kindly recommend that we not summarize the private bills, and that we move to a conclusion of this meeting?
In the spirit of time, it's going to take about 2 minutes to do this. So I would ask you, Matthew, to just be patient for a couple more minutes, and we'll have it. We're in good shape. Okay, good. All right. So 332, an act to amend the criminal code with respect to creating an offense for engaging in controlling or coercive conduct that has a significant impact on persons towards it's directed. Bill C-334, an act to amend the criminal code and the Judges Act to improve communications with the victim before and after a court makes an order to protect the victim's identity. And Bill C-336, an act to amend the criminal code and the sex offender information registry, which is basically to allow the provision that a sex offender who is likely to reoffend must comply with additional provisions for reporting that the information is on record for 30 years. All right, that's it for the Commons. There is one, Howard says there's not a private member's bill in the Senate, but I still refer to it as that. We have Bill C-205 that basically deals with interim release and domestic violence recognizance orders. And we have Bill S-266 bill again, which does exactly the same thing regarding sex offender registration and the 30-year provision. It mirrors the private commons bill, doing exactly the same thing. So one was introduced the day before the other, and that's it. All right. So, any questions or comments for the good of the committee?
Move to adjourn.
All right. Thank you, Matthew. Appreciate it. Dick, thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to having you participate on a regular basis. And Martin, we very much appreciate your input today. It is a tremendous help to us. Thank you.
Miles, who's going to do the minutes for today?
Oh, Peter is doing them by virtue of the recording. It's what he did last time as well.
I always send my notes to whoever's doing it, so
Maybe,
they can.
So
I will send them.
Yeah, please do. All right, guys, thank you very much. Wonderful
All right,
seeing you.
thanks, everybody.
Have a great summer. Have a great summer.
Sorry?
Yeah.
Have a great summer.
Oh, have a great summer. I should before we go, I should make a quick motion that we adjourn for the summer because of the recess. And next meeting is September the 12th. So all in favor?
In favor.
Yes. Thank you, everybody. Have a great summer.
Bye bye. Bye
Thank you.
bye.